Idlewild Airport, Queens. 2:17 p.m. Saturday, August 18, 1962. The terminal air was thick with cigarette smoke and the nervous sweat of travelers rushing toward departure gates. Outside, the August heat shimmered off the tarmac like a fever dream, but inside the Pan American Airways counter, the air conditioning hummed with mechanical precision. Standing third in line, briefcase gripped tight enough to leave permanent impressions in the leather handle, was a man named Vincent "Vinny" Torino, 41 years old. Certified public accountant. Former altar boy from Bensonhurst who'd convinced himself that numbers were colorblind and that respect was just another line item in a ledger. Inside that briefcase sat exactly $100,000 in unmarked bills, money that, until 73 hours ago, had rested in a custom-built floor safe inside a Lenox Avenue apartment. Money that belonged to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Money that Torino had taken not in a moment of desperation, but in a calculated act of intellectual arrogance that would cost him everything he'd ever valued. Torino adjusted his gray suit jacket and checked his watch. Flight 447 to Rome departed in 47 minutes. He'd planned this extraction for 6 months, studying Bumpy's patterns, memorizing security protocols, waiting for the perfect window. He believed he was smarter than the street. He believed that a Columbia Business School education trumped 30 years of Harlem survival. This miscalculation would prove fatal. To understand the terror currently making Torino's hands shake, one must understand what happened 3 days earlier in the back room of Ches Josephine on 125th Street. Bumpy had invited Torino to dinner, a gesture of respect for the man who'd been handling his legitimate business accounts for 8 months. The conversation had been cordial until Torino, emboldened by wine and his own perceived indispensability, made a comment that shattered the evening's civility. "You know," Johnson Torino had said, his voice thick with condescension, "you people should be grateful. Without educated men like me cleaning up your messes, half of Harlem would be back in chains or cages where it belongs." The room went silent. Forks stopped moving. Conversations died. Every man at surrounding tables turned to watch Bumpy's response. Bumpy didn't raise his voice, didn't move. He simply removed his glasses, folded them with surgical precision, and placed them beside his untouched plate. When he looked at Torino, his eyes held the cold finality of a judge reading a death sentence. "When you say you people again," Bumpy said quietly, "remember that I'm the only thing standing between you and consequences you can't calculate." Torino had laughed it off, called it sensitivity, ordered another drink. 72 hours later, he was standing in an airport terminal, convinced that distance and time would save him from his own stupidity. He was wrong. For the past 3 days, Torino hadn't been running. He'd been herded. Every contact he'd reached out to had suddenly become unavailable. His bank accounts weren't frozen. They'd simply vanished from computer systems. His apartment had been visited, not ransacked, but methodically searched and left with a single message. A handwritten note on his pillow that read, "We know where you sleep." At 2:19 p.m., Torino stepped up to the Pan Am counter, passport and ticket in hand. The blonde stewardess smiled professionally, but her eyes held something else. Recognition, perhaps, or pity. As she processed his documents, Torino felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. Not the rough grip of a street enforcer, but the bureaucratic authority of law enforcement. He turned to see 2 detectives, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. But behind them, near a newsstand, stood a solitary figure in a charcoal fedora. The figure nodded once, a gesture of finalized business. Torino realized then that the police weren't there to protect him. They were simply the delivery service for his destruction. The story of how Vincent Torino's arrogance turned a business partnership into a death warrant is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to August 15, 1962. Vincent Torino was born in 1921 in a narrow Bensonhurst row house where his father laid brick and his mother took in washing. The neighborhood operated on proximity to power, and young Vinny learned early that numbers never lied when people did. While other kids learned respect through street corners and baseball bats, he learned it through ledgers in his uncle's social club. By 17, he understood balance sheets better than he understood survival. He clawed his way out through night classes and relentless ambition, earning his accounting degree from Pace College in 1943, then pushing into Columbia Business School. He graduated believing education was armor that elevated him above the street rather than preparing him for it. For 16 years, he built a reputation as the kind of CPA who could make tax problems disappear like morning fog off the East River, handling accounts for legitimate Italian social clubs and union locals where certain businessmen appeared far poorer than their tailored suits suggested. In 1959, Carlo Vitali approached him at a Mulberry Street coffee shop. Vitali was old Brooklyn, pressed suit and careful smile, a man who never used complete sentences when fragments would suffice. The offer came disguised as opportunity. A client in Harlem needed a smart, licensed white accountant to keep serious money out of federal crosshairs. The client's name was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The first meeting was clinical. Bumpy arrived alone in a charcoal suit that cost more than Torino's monthly rent, spending 45 minutes asking questions that revealed he understood accounting principles better than most legitimate clients. The arrangement was straightforward: manage financial operations for several Harlem businesses, ensure tax compliance, create documentation satisfying federal auditors. In exchange, compensation that doubled his current annual income. Bumpy's strategic thinking was surgical. A white accountant with Italian connections provided multiple protection layers. Federal investigators would see legitimate business structures managed by a certified professional with no criminal record. Banks felt safer. Regulators hesitated. Torino's signature didn't just certify numbers, it signaled sophistication that could survive scrutiny. To Bumpy, Torino wasn't a partner. He was an instrument, like a clean knife in dirty business. For 8 months, Torino performed with mechanical efficiency, processing payroll for 63 employees across 7 businesses, filing quarterly returns, maintaining separate ledgers. The money was staggering. Weekly, he might count $40,000 in cash, organizing it into deposits, operating expenses, and amounts that disappeared into coded accounts. He became familiar with the empire's rhythm, the security protocols, the absolute precision. This familiarity bred dangerous arrogance. Torino began believing his education made him essential, that Bumpy needed him more than he needed Bumpy. He started arriving late, offering unsolicited advice, making comments suggesting he viewed himself as partner rather than employee. He convinced himself that without his calculations and tax strategies, Bumpy would be just another aging street legend headed for prison. Bumpy observed the shift in silence. He noted how Torino's eyes lingered on cash stacks, how his tone hardened discussing fees, how he spoke to lieutenants like bank clerks. Instead of tightening control, Bumpy gave him deeper access, more responsibility. It wasn't trust, it was measurement. On August 15, 1962, Bumpy invited Torino to dinner at Ches Josephine on 125th Street, ostensibly recognizing 8 months of satisfactory service. Torino arrived already 2 glasses into his evening, tie loosened, guard completely down. The conversation proceeded pleasantly until, emboldened by wine and inflated self-importance, Torino leaned back and delivered his destruction. "You know, Johnson," he said, voice carrying across nearby tables, "you people should be grateful. Without educated men like me cleaning up your messes, half of Harlem would be back in chains or cages where it belongs." The restaurant went silent with the abruptness of an unplugged record player. Bumpy removed his glasses with mechanical precision, folded them, and placed them beside his untouched plate. His eyes held the cold finality of a judge reading a verdict already written. "When you say you people again," Bumpy said quietly, "remember that I'm the only thing standing between you and consequences you can't calculate." Torino laughed. Actually laughed. He waved dismissively, called for another bottle, suggested Bumpy was being too sensitive. He finished his meal, ordered dessert, left a generous tip. As Torino stumbled out of the restaurant at 11:47 p.m., still chuckling at what he considered Bumpy's oversensitivity, he had no idea that he'd just signed his own execution warrant. The only question remaining was whether it would be written in blood or something far worse. The morning of August 16, 1962, arrived with oppressive humidity that made starched collars wilt before breakfast ended. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Bumpy Johnson departed Harlem for Atlantic City, summoned to mediate a territorial dispute between Philadelphia and Baltimore crews that threatened to spill blood across state lines. The trip was scheduled for 4 days minimum, handled with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that power vacuums invited chaos. His departure was routine by Underworld standards, but to one observer, it represented opportunity measured down to the hour. At 10:15 a.m., Vincent Torino placed his routine weekly call to confirm payroll deposits for the numbers operations. The lieutenant who answered, a young man who never concealed information he considered harmless, mentioned casually that Mr. Johnson is handling business down the coast until Tuesday, unreachable except for emergencies. The tone was offhand, meaningless to most. To Torino, it confirmed what he had been calculating for 6 months, a clear window with the king absent from the board. The theft had not begun with that phone call. It began the previous February, the night Bumpy first granted him access to the Lenox Avenue apartment's back-office safe. While Bumpy's lieutenants counted out gambling receipts, Torino watched the combination sequence with clinical attention. The way the security man positioned his body was meant to block sight lines, but Torino noted the rhythm of the hands, the pattern of pauses, the deliberate repetition. Numbers had always spoken to him. This lock was no different than any other equation requiring solution. 3 right to 17, 2 left to 43, 1 right to 9. Each subsequent visit allowed him more data, building a complete picture of security rotations, cash flow patterns, and operational vulnerabilities. He had mapped the building's traffic in a notebook disguised as tax reference material, tracking when money arrived, when deposits were consolidated, when meetings occurred, and when the apartment remained empty. Over months, he observed that Wednesday through Friday saw heavy cash movement, with Saturday nights reserved for reconciliation. Sunday and Monday were maintenance days with minimal security rotation. This pattern became his operational blueprint. The physical preparation was equally meticulous. During his 3rd month with the organization, he engineered opportunities to study the apartment's security infrastructure. A calculated bump in the hallway allowed him to press graphite-dusted tissue against the apartment key when a lieutenant briefly set it aside. Within a week, he possessed a precision copy machined by an associate in Brooklyn who specialized in such work. In his mind, this was not theft, but intellectual severance. After the dinner humiliation at Ches Josephine, he had constructed an elaborate justification. He told himself He had endured racial condescension, absorbed systematic disrespect, and risked federal prosecution to protect the finances of a man he considered academically inferior. $100,000 represented calculated compensation for danger, an exit package delivered through superior intellect. He convinced himself that Bumpy, as a criminal, possessed no moral claim to money earned through violence and intimidation. By August 18th, every movement had been rehearsed. At 11:30 p.m., wearing a conservative dark suit and carrying his leather briefcase, he approached the Lenox Avenue building through a side entrance he knew received minimal surveillance. A copied key slid into the lock with insulting ease. Inside, the hallway held only distant radio music and the metallic scent of old radiators. Security had been reduced for the weekend, exactly as his calculations predicted. The safe room existed behind reinforced steel in the apartment's rear bedroom, disguised as a utility closet. Inside, the environment was controlled and precise. Cash rested in disciplined stacks on velvet-lined shelves, banded and categorized with mathematical precision. The safe itself was a heavy steel unit bolted into concrete, its combination lock waiting for the sequence he had memorized through months of observation. He knelt before the dial, hands steady now. That theory had become execution. 3 right to 17. 2 left to 43. 1 right to 9. The lock released with quiet finality that sounded like vindication. Inside sat nearly $250,000 in operational capital. He removed exactly $100,000, not a penny more, transferring the bundles to his briefcase with accountant's precision. The ledgers remained untouched beside the cash, his critical mistake that would prove personal rather than professional motivation. Before closing the safe, he placed his prepared message on the empty shelf. Consider this tuition for your education. Some of us actually earned our degrees. The note was deliberate provocation, intellectual superiority expressed through written insult. By 12:10 a.m. on August 19th, he was hailing a taxi to Port Authority, paying the $7 fare and small bills. The Greyhound ticket to Philadelphia cost $18. His escape route was circular misdirection designed to fracture pursuit, Philadelphia by bus, then train back north to Idlewild Airport, creating a trail suggesting southern flight while positioning for international departure. At 12:47 a.m. on August 19th, as Torino settled into his Greyhound seat, he opened a newspaper and smiled at his own cleverness. 300 miles away, Bumpy Johnson was receiving a phone call that would turn that smile into the last moment of peace Torino would ever know. Sunday morning, August 19th, arrived with church bells echoing across Harlem and the comforting smell of bacon drifting through apartment windows. At precisely 9:15 a.m., a lieutenant known as Red entered the Lenox Avenue apartment for routine weekend reconciliation, expecting the familiar ritual of counting receipts and securing operational funds. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry. The hallways held only distant radio music, but when Red opened the steel safe unit, he discovered reorganized cash stacks and empty spaces where $100,000 should have rested in disciplined formation. The interior gaped like a missing tooth. Reserve capital bundles marked for high-level contingencies had vanished with surgical precision. The operational ledgers remained untouched, tax records resting exactly where they belonged, but the theft's selectivity proved this was personal rather than professional desperation. On the velvet shelf lay a folded slip of paper, its message burning into Red's memory as he read the educated arrogance, "Consider this tuition for your education." Some of us actually earned our degrees. At 9:22 a.m., Red placed the emergency call to Atlantic City, where Bumpy Johnson was conducting breakfast business at the Claridge Hotel. The hotel operator connected the call within minutes, and Red delivered his report without preamble or apology. The line went silent for 17 seconds, long enough that Red wondered if the connection had failed. The silence was not shock, but calculation. The sound of a strategic mind processing variables and consequences with mechanical precision. When Bumpy finally spoke, his voice was stripped down to terrifying, functional minimalism. He asked exactly 3 questions with surgical efficiency. How much? 100,000, sir. Exact amount. How long? Safe was secured at 11 last night. Discovery this morning. Window is 10 hours maximum. Who knew I was traveling? Red's stomach dropped as understanding crystallized. Torino called yesterday morning for payroll confirmation. Jimmy mentioned you were handling coastal business through Tuesday. Another silence, shorter this time, filled with calculations Red couldn't see, but could feel through the telephone line like atmospheric pressure before lightning strikes. By 10:45 a.m., Bumpy had chartered a private aircraft from Atlantic City Municipal Airport, paying $800 cash for immediate departure. The aircraft touched down at Teterboro Airport at 12:40 p.m., where a black Cadillac waited with engine running. At 2:30 p.m., Bumpy entered the apartment with the controlled urgency of a surgeon entering an operating theater. The crime scene inspection was conducted in absolute silence. Bumpy examined the safe's interior with methodical attention, leaning in and inhaling deeply. Beneath the metallic scent of steel and the mustiness of old paper, there lingered a faint trace of expensive sandalwood cologne, the same scent Vincent Torino wore like a uniform of intellectual superiority. He lifted the note between 2 fingers, reading it once, then folding it carefully into his jacket pocket. When he turned to his men, his verdict carried judicial finality. This isn't theft. This is disrespect. Handle it accordingly. The blackout order activated at 3:15 p.m. with systematic precision. This was not spontaneous violence but calculated isolation, a protocol refined over 3 decades. Calls went out to train porters at Penn Station and Grand Central, to shift managers at Port Authority, to taxi dispatchers across the eastern seaboard, to hotel clerks from Manhattan to Philadelphia. Torino's photograph moved through this network with instructions: watch, don't touch. Report location immediately. Simultaneously, psychological warfare began through banking contacts who understood that certain favors created permanent obligations. By 5:00 p.m., Torino's accounts at Chase Manhattan and First National City Bank had been flagged for suspicious activity. His credit cards generated mysterious decline codes. His apartment lease came under sudden review by building management. By 6 p.m. On August 19th, Vincent Torino had become a ghost in his own life. His money was gone, his apartment was compromised, and somewhere in Harlem, Ellsworth Johnson was making phone calls that would ensure Torino's next 72 hours would be his last as a free man. By the evening of August 19th, Vincent Torino's carefully constructed escape plan had begun disintegrating with the precision of controlled demolition. At 7:45 p.m., he entered the Chase Manhattan branch on Fifth Avenue, presenting identification and withdrawal slip for his emergency account containing $12,000 in carefully accumulated reserves. The teller processed his request with professional efficiency, disappearing into the back office for what should have been routine verification. She returned 8 minutes later with apologetic confusion, explaining that his account had been flagged for suspicious activity pending federal review. No withdrawals could be processed until the matter cleared, possibly within 7 to 10 business days. Torino's hands trembled as he signed the dispute form, knowing he possessed neither 7 days nor 10. He tried First National City Bank with identical results. By 9:30 p.m., standing on a street corner with $100,000 in stolen cash, but unable to access his own legitimate funds, he understood this was orchestrated rather than coincidental. The coordination was surgical, each institution receiving identical instructions through channels he couldn't see, but could feel closing around him like a methodical trap. He checked into the Gramercy Park Hotel under a false name, paying cash for 3 nights and requesting a room facing the street for quick departure visibility. At 11:20 p.m., he left briefly to purchase cigarettes and a newspaper from the corner drugstore, needing movement to calm his rising panic. When he returned 17 minutes later, the room appeared exactly as he had left it. Door locked, windows secure, briefcase containing the stolen money untouched on the desk. But the details betrayed intrusion with terrifying precision. His shaving kit had been moved from the sink to the back of the toilet. His tie, which he'd thrown across the chair, was now folded over the hanger in the closet. The notepad by the phone had been rotated 90 degrees. The air carried a faint trace of stale tobacco smoke, though he didn't smoke. Someone had been inside, rearranging his possessions with surgical precision to deliver a message more terrifying than theft: we know where you sleep, and we can reach you whenever we choose. Tuesday, August 20th, brought the horrifying realization that he was not being hunted, but herded. Every attempted escape route collapsed with suspicious efficiency. At 10:00 a.m., he tried hailing a taxi to Penn Station. 7 cabs passed him on Lexington Avenue, all displaying vacant lights, none stopping despite his desperate waving. An 8th slowed, the driver making eye contact and recognizing something that triggered instant refusal before accelerating away. The transportation network of New York City had been weaponized against him, forcing him underground into the subway system he despised. Forced into the humid tunnels, Torino descended at Grand Central, purchasing a token with hands that had begun to shake visibly. The psychological warfare intensified below ground. At 23rd Street, 2 men in conservative suits entered his car, taking seats with clear sight lines to his position. They did not approach, did not speak, simply watched with the patient attention of museum guards observing valuable paintings. At 14th Street, they exited. At 8th Street, 2 different men in similar suits boarded, assuming identical positions and maintaining the same silent observation. By Christopher Street, Torino's breakdown had become visible to other passengers. Sweat darkened his collar despite the underground chill. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. He began muttering to himself, fragments of calculation and prayer mixing into incoherent desperation. Other passengers moved away instinctively, creating isolation within the crowded car. The men in suits never moved closer, never spoke. But their presence was constant, rotating at each stop like shifts in a factory designed to manufacture fear. Wednesday morning, August 21st, delivered the final ultimatum with devastating clarity. At 8:30 a.m., a hotel porter knocked on his door with a package marked for his false name. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper, sat a one-way Pan American Airways ticket to Rome, departing that afternoon at 3:15 p.m. Beneath it lay a photograph that stopped his heart. The image showed his 73-year-old mother leaving morning mass at Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in Bensonhurst, her familiar black dress and rosary beads captured in sharp focus. The photograph had been taken that very morning, evidenced by the fresh newspaper visible in a nearby trash can. No note accompanied the items. None was necessary. The message was architectural in its clarity: run now or watch your family suffer consequences your theft has purchased. The logic was inescapable and brutal. Bumpy wasn't just chasing him, he was guiding him toward a specific exit, offering him one final choice that wasn't really a choice at all. The journey to Idlewild Airport became a monitored procession. Every step was anticipated. Every movement tracked through networks Torino had never imagined existed. The taxi that finally stopped for him drove with unusual precision, the route slightly longer than necessary, as if the driver was following instructions to deliver cargo on a specific timeline. At traffic lights, the driver adjusted his rearview mirror to maintain visual contact. On the airport shuttle, a newspaper vendor nodded almost imperceptibly as Torino passed. By 2:15 p.m., Torino stood in the Idlewild terminal, his briefcase now containing exactly $97,200. The missing $2,800 had evaporated into hotel bills, failed banking attempts, and the mounting costs of psychological siege warfare. His suit was wrinkled, his face unshaven, his eyes carrying the hollow desperation of a man who had discovered that intelligence without wisdom was just elaborate suicide. Every mile of his journey had been monitored, every decision anticipated by men who understood that true power lay not in violence, but in the systematic removal of all alternatives. As Torino approached the Pan Am counter at 2:17 p.m., he spotted a familiar face near the newsstand, one of Bumpy's men, checking his watch with the patience of someone who knew exactly how this story would end. The Pan American Airways counter represented salvation in Vincent Torino's collapsing world. Fluorescent lights humming with the promise of 3,000 miles between him and Harlem's reach. At 2:17 p.m., he placed his passport and ticket on the marble surface with hands that had finally stopped shaking, watching the blonde stewardess process his documents with mechanical efficiency. For one brief moment, observing her stamp his boarding pass, he allowed himself to believe that intelligence had triumphed over brutality, that Rome would erase the consequences of his arrogance. Before he could turn toward the departure gates, a heavy hand settled on his shoulder with bureaucratic authority that felt nothing like street enforcement. The voice that followed was polite, almost apologetic. "Sir, I'm Detective Raymond Walsh, Port Authority Police. This is Detective Carmine Russo. We need you to step aside for routine security." They were not the muscle Torino had feared for 3 days. Walsh was Irish, mid-40s, with the patient demeanor of a man who collected pension contributions rather than debts. Russo was younger, Italian, wearing a wedding ring and cheap tie that suggested legitimate civil service. Their badges were authentic, their authority unquestionable, but the timing carried orchestration that transcended coincidence. Walsh guided Torino to a pillar offering partial privacy, while Russo methodically searched his briefcase. During the seemingly routine pat-down, Russo executed the most important move of the operation. In fluid, practiced motion, he slipped a velvet jewelry case into Torino's coat pocket with pickpocket precision. When his hand emerged moments later holding the same case, his expression shifted from routine boredom to professional interest. Inside rested an emerald necklace and matching earrings, distinctive pieces reported stolen from a Fifth Avenue residence 3 weeks earlier. The jewelry had been waiting in evidence storage for exactly such a moment. Property that would survive any courtroom scrutiny. Torino's hysteria erupted with the force of accumulated terror finally finding release. Words spilled out in chaotic torrents about mob connections, about stealing $100,000 from Ellsworth Johnson, about being hunted by organized crime networks. He begged for federal protection, offered to testify about gambling operations and money laundering schemes, promised cooperation in exchange for witness security. Walsh and Russo exchanged glances that communicated volumes of practiced indifference. They were focused entirely on the planted jewelry, documenting serial numbers with methodical attention. Torino's mob confessions received bureaucratic dismissal reserved for obviously fabricated stories. Walsh even chuckled, suggesting that everyone caught with stolen property suddenly claimed mob connections, as if federal marshals handed out protection like subway tokens. Across the terminal, Near a newsstand selling cigarettes and racing forms, Ellsworth Johnson stood in a charcoal suit and fedora, watching the arrest unfold with detached interest. He was not there for the money, which would be recovered within minutes. He was there for the message, for the architectural demonstration that disrespect carried consequences more devastating than violence. His presence was statement rather than supervision. At 2:34 p.m., handcuffs clicked shut with mechanical efficiency. Torino dropped to his knees, begging for mercy from authorities who possessed neither interest nor jurisdiction over his actual crimes. His expensive suit collected terminal floor dirt, his dignity evaporating into hysterical pleading that attracted stares from travelers who would remember the scene for years. The briefcase containing $97,200 sat abandoned near the security office. Within 90 seconds, an airport janitor in coveralls, pushing a cleaning cart, collected the forgotten luggage and disappeared into service corridors beyond passenger awareness. The money would return to Harlem by evening. By 6:00 p.m., evening papers carried headlines designed for maximum humiliation: accountant arrested for grand larceny at airport. The articles detailed jewelry theft, mentioned Torino's Columbia credentials, but made no mention of Bumpy Johnson or stolen cash. His CPA license faced immediate suspension. His family received calls from reporters. His clients began terminating contracts within hours. The systematic destruction was architectural, each element reinforcing the others until nothing remained except humiliation and legal jeopardy. As the police car pulled away from Idlewild Airport, Torino pressed his face against the window and saw Bumpy Johnson standing beside a black Cadillac, lighting a cigarette with the calm satisfaction of a man who had just balanced the most important ledger of his life. The state of New York processed Vincent Torino with bureaucratic efficiency that transformed his entire existence into docket numbers and case files. The trial lasted 4 days in October 1962, conducted with procedural precision that left no room for alternative narratives. The emerald necklace and matching earrings provided prosecutors with clean, undeniable evidence. Security footage confirmed his possession at Idlewild Airport. Detectives Walsh and Russo testified with polished professionalism about a routine security check escalating into discovery of stolen property. Torino's frantic testimony about mob connections and stolen cash was dismissed as desperate fiction, the calculated lies of a caught thief attempting to manufacture complexity where simple larceny existed. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. In February 1963, the judge sentenced him to 3 to 5 years in federal prison, citing his education and professional standing as aggravating factors that demonstrated calculated criminality rather than impulsive desperation. Attica Correctional Facility became the classroom where Vincent Torino's real education commenced. Within 2 weeks of his arrival, word had circulated through networks connecting street to cell block that the new inmate was not merely a jewelry thief, but the accountant who had stolen $100,000 from Bumpy Johnson and survived long enough to reach prison. His fellow inmates treated him with the peculiar mixture of fascination and contempt reserved for men who had violated codes more fundamental than law. Italian inmates viewed him as a traitor who violated loyalty. Black inmates viewed him as a fool who disrespected a legend. He was not beaten or killed, which would have granted dignity through violence. Instead, he was isolated, mocked, reminded daily that his Columbia degree meant nothing in a world that valued respect over intelligence. The recovered money never entered evidence logs or federal asset seizures. By evening on August 21st, it had returned to Harlem, where Bumpy distributed portions into community programs with strategic precision. $5,000 went to the Abyssinian Baptist Church Building Fund. 10,000 funded scholarship programs for neighborhood children. 20,000 disappeared into legitimate business investments employing local residents. The distribution was not charity but public relations, reinforcing Bumpy's carefully constructed image as community protector rather than criminal predator. Every dollar Torino stole became testament to Bumpy's benevolence, the message clear. What one man tried to take through greed, another gave through loyalty. Torino's family disowned him with Italian efficiency. His father stopped accepting collect calls by December 1962. His mother removed his photographs from the Bensonhurst apartment. His sister legally changed her surname. The professional destruction was equally thorough. His CPA license faced permanent revocation in January 1963. Columbia Business School removed his name from alumni directories. Former clients testified they had always suspected irregularities in his accounting practices, rewriting history to distance themselves from association. He served 4 years, released in October 1966 with the hollow eyes of a man whose arrogance had been systematically extracted through institutional humiliation. At 45, he found work as a bookkeeper for small businesses in Newark, processing payroll for dry cleaners and pizza parlors, never again handling amounts exceeding a few $1,000s. He lived in a studio apartment, rode buses to work, spoke to almost no one about his previous life. The arrogance that had fueled his theft was gone, replaced by permanent nervous tics and a habit of checking exits in every room. The broader message resonated through Bumpy's network with architectural precision. Every accountant, lawyer, and businessman who handled money for the organization understood that technical competence provided no protection against fundamental disrespect. The cost was not death, which granted martyrdom and quick resolution, but systematic destruction of everything defining identity, reputation, family, profession, dignity. This understanding created loyalty more durable than fear of violence. Bumpy's philosophy, shared quietly with his inner circle, revealed the strategic thinking behind the operation. Violence was temporary, he explained. A man could recover from broken bones, rebuild after physical intimidation. But humiliation was permanent, embedded in public record and collective memory. Fear was inherited, passed from one generation of associates to the next through stories that became cautionary architecture. The note Torino had left in the safe achieved prophetic irony. His mockery of Bumpy's lack of formal education became his own epitaph. He had indeed provided education, though not the kind intended. The lesson cost him everything he valued, which was precisely the tuition Bumpy had calculated. Intelligence without wisdom was elaborate suicide, and some teachers graded with consequences rather than letters. Historically, this incident solidified Bumpy's reputation for systematic, precise justice that transcended street violence. Federal investigators noted that Johnson's operation experienced virtually no internal theft or betrayal between 1962 and his death in 1968. The Torino case became organizational folklore, the story told to new associates as warning and instruction. Vincent Torino died in 1987, 25 years after he opened that safe. He never spoke publicly about what happened, never wrote a memoir, never sought revenge. When asked about his fall from grace, he would only say, "I learned that some educations cost more than others, and some teachers don't give second chances." The lesson of Torino's theft isn't just about crime, it's about the architecture of respect. In a world where your word was your bond, and breaking that bond meant losing everything you thought you were.